To Sociology Anthropology 400. I just want to give a quick run through of the syllabus here, give you a sense of what the course entails, what my expectations are, what we're going to do, and things like that. So, without any further ado, let's take a look. The broad strokes of the course are that it's a research course, so you're going to be doing original research in the form of interviews, but they're going to be focused on a particular thing, and that is how the it's sort of a twofold thing. On the one hand, then, how the pandemic has disoriented people's lives, maybe um, how it's disrupted their day-to-day routines, but also how it interfered with their sense of what they could expect from life, whether they had a clear sense of mooring in everyday life, or if that got thrown into disarray as well, if they became disoriented in their everyday lives. So you could think also, as an example, that at the beginning, many people experienced deep uncertainty about whether they were infected but not symptomatic and therefore presented a threat to those around them, whether other people were infected but didn't know it, or maybe did know it but weren't doing anything about it, and therefore posed a threat to the individual. So that what it meant to be around other people, to be in social relations, became a much more fraught thing than we're used to it being. So that's one part of it. The other part of it then is in the light of this disruption that the pandemic has had for people's sense of ordinary life, what things, if any, have they done in order to restore a sense of ordinariness to their lives? It may be the case that some people haven't, that some people are continuing to experience what I'm calling this feeling of disorientation, this feeling of being in disarray, this feeling of not being able to find their feet in everyday life. But other people may have undertaken particular sorts of things that have helped them. And so those are the sorts of things that we want to tease out, find out what's worked, what hasn't, uh, not in a kind of functional way, as if we're trying to figure out, okay, so if we were going to set a program for people to regain their sense of everyday life, here's the three-step program we would take. Not anything like that, but rather what sorts of experiments have people undertaken with what result. And it may be that the result is that they've discovered things about their lives that the pandemic has allowed them to change in their favor, to the better. Other things, it may be that they have had to entertain compromises in their everyday lives that they simply never would have entertained before. But in this new reality, that's the kind of sacrifice or um, concession that they've had to give in order to have what feels like an ordinary life again. So that's the very broad strokes of what we're aiming for with this course. So, how are we going to do it? Well, there are going to be five main things that we have to do. The first one is the City Human Subjects Protocol. So, in anthropology or sociology or psychology or any of the social sciences that involve doing research with human beings, and also in some cases with animals, but we're concerned with human beings here. What you have to do is show that the research that you're doing is ethically sound, that you're doing it according to accepted sound procedures and methods, and that you're going to protect the people who you're studying, protect their confidentiality, for example, and that you know how to go about doing that. That's what this human subjects protocol mini course does. So it's very quick. You can probably get it done in half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that. But you have to get it done first thing before you do any interviews or anything like that. So that's the first thing up. Second will be a literature review. Now, many of you, excuse me, will not have done a literature review before, and that's okay. We'll work through that, figure out what it is, what it's doing for you, and I'll explain a little bit later on why this is an important part of the course overall and will be important for your final paper in the end as well. So, a literature review then is, in contrast to the kinds of essays that you're probably used to writing, a literature review is not making an argument of any sort. It's a descriptive piece of work rather than an argumentative piece of work. So you're trying to give the lay of the land for a given body of scholarship. You're trying to give a sense of what the main concerns with people who participate in that body of scholarship are. What are the main debates? At what points do people have shared concerns, but different ways of handling those concerns, different ways of investigating them? What are the main sorts of conclusions or theoretical insights that people are drawing from this kind of investigation? These are the things that you want to get so that you're not trying to give an assessment, an evaluation of this field of scholarship. You're trying to give a description of it. And so to do that, you'll have, excuse me, you'll have 5 sources in the first literature review that you do. You're going to do a second one for the final paper. That one is going to be based on the first one that you do. But for the first one, you have 5 sources. So 4 of those sources will come from the theoretical readings that we have, the anthropological readings at the beginning of the semester, and 1 supplementary reading that is, I give you a bibliography that you can select from. All of those are going to be available on Blackboard. And so you'll have to take things that we've talked about in the course, in class, and figure out how that 5th supplementary reading integrates with those, how you want to put those in discussion with one another. Then the heart of the research that you're going to do will be the interviews. You'll have 3 of those, and I give a description of what I expect from those, but in brief, they will be interviews with whoever you like about whatever you like, as long as it's giving you information about how this individual responds to these questions of everyday life. So whether they are, say, a business owner and you want to talk to them about how the pandemic affected business, or if it was an employee of a business, how it affected their working life. If you're interviewing, say, a frontline worker or an essential worker, maybe a nurse or an EMT or firefighter, something like that, what implications the pandemic had for them, and so on and so forth. So you can focus it with respect to those individuals how you like, but it still has to come back to these questions of the implications of the pandemic for everyday life. So you'll have 3 of those, as I say. They should be, you should aim for at least 45 minutes. Ideally, at least one of them will be significantly longer than that. Don't interview immediate family members. It's too hard to have good interviews with people who are that close to you. So step out of your immediate family, find other people to interview, and ideally you'll have at least one person who you interview more than once. Now you can interview more than one person at a time. So if you say want to interview a couple, you can interview the couple, but that's one interview. Then maybe you just want to interview one of those individuals for your follow up interview. Well, then that's fine. So then you have the follow up interview with that person. Now these, uh, you've had two interviews with one person present in both of them. That's great. And then you carry on with your third for whoever you want. We'll talk more about that in the course as it goes, but that's sort of the rough outline of what I want. In addition to the interviews, you'll be reporting on those interviews. What I'm calling here fieldwork progress reports. You can also just call them interview reports. So then, what you'll do for those, you'll have two of those for your first two interviews. They're not meant to be formal presentations. They're meant to be troubleshooting sessions so that if there are particular things that you ran into as problems during the interview, then we'll talk about those and collectively figure out strategies for dealing with those sorts of problems so that you don't need to replicate them in the next interview. If there are things that were particularly interesting for you, you'll talk about those things. If there are things that you see echoing themes that came up in the readings, then great, you'll flag those things as things that will become important for the final paper. And so you can talk about how your interviewee has said things that recall those themes or those topics and so forth. The other part of the other purpose, let's say, for the interview reports is that by doing them, all the students know what all the other students are looking at in their interviews. If there are points of overlap, if there are particular topics that come up in multiple people's interviews, then you'll have things to talk about. You'll be able to enrich your own work, your own study, by entering into these conversations with other interviewers, other students. So that's what those are about. Again, we'll talk more about those as the time approaches. And then you'll have the final paper. I'm going to just pause on the final paper. I'll come back to it at the end. For now, I'll just leave it as the final thing that you have. So here's what the schedule will look like for when things are coming due. So by March 10th, you should have the city certificate completed. Let me reiterate then, you cannot do interviews until you've completed that course and gotten the certificate and emailed it to me. All the assignments, by the way, you'll email to me. All your notes, the final paper, the literature review, the certificate, all of that, email only. A week after that, your first set of interview notes will be due. Again, I'll come back to talk more about what the interview notes should contain, but the brief story is you've done your interview, you've jotted things down through the interview. The notes that you'll send to me will be the notes that you draw up in full sentences, full paragraphs that give an account of the interview. Now you're sending them to me, but they're really actually for you. They are the primary resources you're going to draw on when you write your paper. So you're trying to compose notes that are going to be as helpful as possible for you when you go to write the final paper. That's the purpose of them. So I'll be evaluating the notes then, not on whether I think they're well composed as something you're giving to me, but rather if you're composing them in a way that they will provide a good resource for you when you go to write up your final paper. I'm going to collect all of the notes together, and they will I'll put them in a file. They'll be on Blackboard, so that when you hear another student presenting and something that student says sounds like an echo of what you've encountered in your interview, you'll be able to look at those notes for the final paper and you'll be able to cite them so that you're not restricted only to your own interview. You'll be able to draw on other students' interviews as well. So as you can see, there will be notes, a report, a second set of notes, a second report, and then there will be a third set of notes, but no third report, because by that point we're at the end of the semester. And you won't have any other interviews to do. Anyway, you'll only have the final paper. So the way it breaks down is like this. The city subjects course is 5 points. If you get it into me, it's 5 points. I'm not grading it. If you do it, you get the 5 points. Simple as that. The literature review is going to be 10 points. So it's important, but I'm not making it a very costly exercise because, as I say, I recognize most of you have never done one of these before. So what I want is to have the opportunity to give you feedback on your first literature review so that you'll know what it should look like for the final paper. It's absolutely essential to take a run at this early in the semester so that you can figure out what a literature review is supposed to look like, what kind of work it's supposed to do for you for your final paper or within any kind of a large writing project. But I'm trying to make it an inexpensive exercise so that if things go wrong for you, it's not going to be a devastating thing for your final grade. And then you see the final paper is worth half your grade. So the way that I have this designed is that everything that you do through the course of the semester is going to be kind of like a trial run of that kind of exercise. Trial run at doing a literature review, a trial run at interviews, a trial run at writing up the notes for the interviews that you'll draw on for the final paper, so that when the time comes to write the final paper, you'll already have a lot of experience with the kinds of things that are going to go into that paper. And then it's just a matter of bringing it all together. That's not a small project, but you should be well prepared by the time that you start to write the final essay, so that you're not feeling like a fish out of water. Now, the final paper, it's a significant piece of writing. It's going to be 15 to 20 pages, and that will sound at this point in the semester like a lot, but by the time you get to writing it, I think what you'll discover is that coming up with the minimum 15 pages is not going to be a problem. That the problem will be to figure out how to stop writing, not how to write enough. And that's a good problem to have. So, okay, so then now let's look at how we're going to make our way through the syllabus itself. We're going to start off by trying to get a sense of what we mean by the ordinary or the everyday, so that when we're talking about disruptions to the everyday or disruptions to the ordinary, what it is that we're thinking about, what we're considering. And so we start off then with a couple of essays by Veena Das, who has written extensively on these themes. And so we'll look at two pieces by her, separated by 13 years, but that should do a lot of work for us in getting thinking about how we want to consider what the everyday, what we mean by the everyday. So throughout the semester, typically we'll have video lectures. They're posted on the link on YouTube that got you here, in fact. And you'll watch those on Monday, and then on Wednesdays we meet in person to discuss the readings and the lectures. Of course, you'll also do the readings. Ideally, you'll do the readings before you watch the videos, but if you find that it's most helpful to watch the video and then do the reading, or to do some kind of alternative where maybe you start with one, then you do the other, then you go back to the first one, whatever the case may be, that's open to you. But you should have the readings done and the videos watched by the time you come in on Wednesday so that we can talk about them. You'll have a clear sense of what's going on when we're having a discussion about them. And you'll have a sense of what it is that you want to ask in order to clarify things, what it is that you want to raise as a topic that you found particularly interesting or valuable given your own projects, whatever that might be. In other words, you'll come prepared. Makes sense, I hope. Then we're going to move on to a piece by Clara Hahn. And one of the things that I particularly like about putting Clara Hahn and Veena Das's works together is that they draw not entirely on the same bodies of literature to think about the everyday. There is a lot of overlap, but it's not complete overlap. And so they wind up discussing different aspects of the everyday. And so I find them mutually enriching in a very helpful way. The following week, so February 13th, we don't have any class on the Monday. So instead, we're going to take a break from the anthropological work, and then on Wednesday when we meet, we're going to talk just about writing ethnographic field notes. So that this is not a piece that you'll include in the literature review. Clara Hahn's piece, yes. Veena Das's piece, sure. But not this one by Emerson, Fretz, and Shaw. This is just to get an initial sense of how it is that you're going to go about doing the research, the interviews, how you should approach them, what you should think about, what you should consider, and so then how you'll draw what you learn from the interviews into a coherent paper. Then we get back to the ethnographic work with Fiona Ross's piece on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And then in week 6, we look at Sasanka Perera's piece that's based in Sri Lanka. Now with these two, we're entering kind of a different set of questions about the everyday and about recovery of the everyday after a moment of crisis. And so these look at two different ways of trying to cope with crisis, with either protracted crises or moments of crisis, depending on how you want to look at these two, and what it is that people have done to address the crisis and try to restore a sense of everyday life. The final major piece that we look at by Roma Chatterjee and Deepak Mehta also looks at that same sort of question in a different setting. So rather than South Africa, as with Fiona Ross, or Sri Lanka, as with Perera, here we're looking at a neighborhood in Mumbai, in India. And so these pieces focus mostly, and Veena Das's pieces, in fact, also really look at moments of crisis that are characterized by violence. So, of course, not all crises are violent in nature, and not all sorts of violence are going to throw into question the sense of the ordinary or the sense of the everyday. But that's what they're looking at. For the purposes of this course and for your papers, what's most important about them is less that they're talking about violence than that they're talking about crisis, the impact that crisis has within communities and within people's lives, and then how people have responded to these crises with whatever degrees of success at recapturing a sense of everyday life. Following that then, so following these theoretical anthropological readings, that's when the city certificate will do, and that marks the switch in the syllabus from sort of the theoretical backdrop of anthropological work to doing the actual work of the interviews. Now, a week after the city certificate is due, your first fieldwork notes, your first interview notes, are also going to be due. So, what I would urge is that you try and get the certificate done early in the semester. As I say, it's not a very time intensive thing. You should be able to get it done pretty quickly. And that way, you can start organizing your interviews much earlier. You can conduct your first interview much earlier, and then your notes will be ready on the due date of the 17th. Following that, we're going to spend the next few weeks first talking about how to compose notes, what you want to include, how you want to draft them, and there will be a number of readings associated with that. They're pretty short. They're mostly sort of technique readings to give you a sense of just how you go about doing it. And of course, we'll already have had the readings from earlier in the semester to prepare you. So this is just a way of deepening your sense of what you want to include in notes, how you want to compose them, how you want to make them work for you down the road when you write. The next 2 weeks, we'll have presentations on your first interviews. Then we have spring recess, and immediately after spring recess, your second set of notes will be due. So that's almost a month between when your first notes are due and when your second notes are due. So you should be able to schedule and conduct your second interviews in that period without much trouble. Then it follows the same pattern. You present on your second set of notes. Shortly after that, your third set of fieldwork notes will be due. And then in the final 2 weeks, we're not going to have any more new assignments or new material that you need to do. On May 10th, we're going to have a focus group. I'll say more about that in class. It has to do mostly with how prepared you have felt coming to this assignment in terms of having the methods that you need to go out and conduct the interviews. So it will be kind of like an opportunity to reflect on your college career as a whole, to think about whether you've been well prepared to do this kind of work or not. And then the final week, week 16, we don't have a class on the Wednesday, but I'll be available to consult if you are having troubles with your paper of any sort, and so you can troubleshoot things then. Of course, you'll be able to troubleshoot things that come up with your paper in all of the classes that come before that, but that will just be dedicated to troubleshooting your paper. And then you'll get to your final paper. So I want you to think of your paper on an analogy, or at least if this analogy doesn't work for you, then just don't use it, ignore it. But I'm trying to give you a sense of how the different pieces could fit together. And so the analogy that I want to use is a court case. So imagine you're presenting an argument in court. You're going to have, I guess, three main things. You're going to present evidence. You're going to present the evidence in the light of precedent, right? So previous court cases, previous rulings, and you're going to form an argument on the basis of the evidence in the light of the precedent or precedents in order to reach or in order to persuade your audience of a particular conclusion, the conclusion that your argument is driving toward. So in a court case, then, precedent would, as I say, would be earlier rulings, whatever the courts have written up in their previous rulings. And in our case, instead of previous rulings, we have the literature, the scholarship that exists before you come to this project. So all of the readings that we've been through at the beginning of the semester and the supplementary readings that you also include in your final paper. So what will that look like? At the beginning of your paper, after your introduction, you're going to have a larger literature review than the one that you handed in earlier in the semester. So instead of being 5 sources, it will be 9 sources. It will have the 6 course readings that we've done by Das, Han, Ross, Perera, and Chatterjee and Mehta, and the 1 supplementary reading that you already included in your first literature review, as well as 2 more supplementary readings. So that will be 3 supplementary readings in total, 1 of which you'll already have looked at, 2 of which will be new. And so you're doing the same thing with that literature review that you did with the first one. You're giving the lay of the land about a body of scholarship. What are the central topics of that body of scholarship, or the central themes? How do different contributors to this body of scholarship approach those themes? How do they enter into conversation with one another, either directly by speaking of one another's work, or indirectly by you putting those pieces into conversation with one another in your literature review itself, discussing how they address these themes in similar or in different ways, how they arrive at similar or different conclusions. As I said before, if there are major debates that characterize this field of scholarship, what are those debates? What are the positions that people take? So you're describing that field. Again, you're not offering an opinion on any aspect of the contribution to that field. That's not the work of a literature review, in the same way that it's not the work of an argument within a legal case. You're rather setting up the theoretical framework within which you will present your evidence. So then we get to the evidence. You're not obviously going to reproduce all of the notes that you've created in the interviews that you've conducted. You're going to select the things from the interviews that are relevant to the argument that you want to make. So you're, in the course of an argument, telling your reader what it is that you learned from your interviews, and you're packaging it with respect to the pre-existing scholarship that you've already presented in your literature review, and then describing here you're not describing. Here you're making an argument. You're presenting a thesis on the basis of that evidence that you've collected. What that argument is going to be is open-ended at this point. Each of you will probably have a different argument that you want to make, because you're interviewing different people about specific things specific to those individuals. And so the arguments that you make will be distinctive in that respect. How you connect it back to the literature, the scholarship that is, will be distinctive in each of your cases. And of course, you can draw on one another's interviews as well as your own to just enrich the body of evidence that you have in order to make the case that you want to make. And that will essentially be it. That will you'll write up your paper, and by that point in the course, you'll probably be well warranted and feeling pretty proud of the work that you've done, because this is a fairly major project. So that's that. Welcome to the course, and I look forward to seeing you in class.